KTCU FM Fort Worth. You've made it to the end of another long work week. So sit back, relax, and enjoy a few guys talking sports for the next hour. This is Friday Night Sports. Here's Ben Otten, James Flowers, and Mitchell LaFave.
What's up, guys, and welcome to Friday Night Sports. I'm Ben Otten, and alongside me are James Flowers and Mitchell LaFave. As you can probably tell, I'm not feeling so well, so probably going to let Mitch and James do most of the talking tonight. But anyway, with that in mind, we've had another fun weekend of college football last weekend, packed full of top 25 matchups, which we'll recap shortly. And we'll get you set for a trio of top 10 matchups coming up tomorrow as the college football regular season begins to wind down. Guys, let's start with a top 25 matchup, the premier matchup usually in the SEC, as the 19th ranked LSU Tigers traveled to Tuscaloosa, took on the second ranked Alabama Crimson Tide, with the Tide coming out on top by a score of 24-10. That being said, this Alabama offense didn't really get going at all against a good LSU defense, but not a great LSU defense. Do you credit the Tigers for coming up with a game plan and frustrating Alabama, or is this worrying from the Crimson Tide's perspective?
I mean, I would give a good amount of credit to the LSU defense. They held the Tide to their lowest point total since week one against Florida State. Alabama only scored once per quarter. And I wouldn't say it's too worrying for Alabama either, though, since LSU has been one of their toughest opponents this season. I mean, yeah, LSU's been up and down. But honestly, I don't think Alabama really has to worry about anything until Auburn at the end of the season.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of credit to be dished out in various areas. LSU's defense played well, obviously not quite well enough, but still gave up only 24 points to Alabama. And as for the Alabama offense, what's so interesting is that they tailor their offense to the team they're playing each week. And I think every team does that to a certain extent. But Nick Saban referred to their offensive playbook as something to like a restaurant menu. There's so many different options, yet some plays only feel right in a certain situation given the spot they're in. They practice a lot of plays in the summer, and some of those plays they practice a lot might not come into play until November or next week or late in the season. So, got to give a lot of credit to Alabama and LSU, but Alabama just seemed to outplay LSU this weekend.
That's an interesting point, James, because when I heard you say that, I kept thinking, they have a 19-year-old true sophomore quarterback, and that's a lot to put on his plate. I know Jalen Hurts has struggled a bit at times. Hasn't had the most outstanding numbers. Obviously, does not turn the ball over hardly ever, but his yardage totals and touchdown numbers aren't exactly great. You think that has something to do with the fact that he is stacked full with a bunch of plays and really leads a very complex offense for Alabama?
Yeah, I think so. Offensive coordinator Brian Daboll said this week that the Crimson Tide ran a lot of crossing routes and play action routes because LSU stacked the box and played man coverage. So while Jalen Hurts isn't a great passer, like you said, he only completed 46% of his passes against LSU. He's done enough to lead Alabama to an undefeated season thus far. And I think with the wide or expansive playbook, it gives him a lot of options. And if he's able to recognize the coverage and he's got a few different plays in his back pocket, he can choose which one works. And I think that just kind of comes with experience. So while he is young, he's going to get a couple more years under his belt. And maybe that's when we'll see the real Jalen Hurts, because I think this season he's just been a bit of a game manager type quarterback.
Yeah, and while he's not the best at passing, I think you said, 46% completion percentage. And Ben, you mentioned it a couple of minutes ago. He doesn't turn the ball over. He doesn't complete a whole bunch of his passes, but he's relatively smart with the way he throws it. He's only thrown one pick all season, and he's also great on the ground. He's got, I don't have it up, but probably around the same amount of rushing yards as he does passing yards, if not more touchdowns on the ground. He can beat you better that way, but you still also have to be a little bit careful in the air.
Yeah, I don't think Jalen Hurts gets the credit he deserves. I mean, his numbers aren't mind-blowing, but he does a great job under a lot of pressure leading Alabama. Were you guys surprised on a larger scale to see Bama stay at number 2 still behind number 1 Georgia, even after a top 25 win and Alabama's, first in the season?
Yeah, I was a little surprised, not so much about Alabama, but more so that Georgia stayed at number 1, only because their win against South Carolina was not really convincing. They scored their third touchdown late to really give them a 14-point cushion. And while South Carolina is an okay team, they're not great, they're not terrible either. I really thought Georgia would blow them out of the water, and it just really wasn't the case. So I was a little surprised that Georgia stayed at number 1, and Alabama I think is fine at number 2. But I mean that's the committee. I guess they must not have had too much worry about Georgia this week.
Yeah, I don't know. I think South Carolina in the past at least has always played Georgia tough, and I mean South Carolina's team I would like to think is on the up. Obviously a couple injuries and Georgia being at home and not really playing, like you said, not really playing all that well and not having all that convincing of a win. I was surprised to see it as well. But yeah, and speaking of teams in South Carolina, let's move on to another top 25 matchup. 4th-ranked Clemson went on the road, took on number 20 NC State, and the Tigers escaped with a 38-31 win. It seems like this is the final hurdle, at least looking at their schedule for Clemson in the regular season. Obviously, it looks like a matchup with Miami coming up in the ACC Championship should Clemson continue to win. Is there any reason to believe that Clemson won't make the playoff? Like I said, this appears to be their last major obstacle. 38 points for this Clemson offense is a lot, and I think Kelly Bryant played a big role in that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned I think the only way Clemson won't make the playoff is if they lose in the ACC Championship. I mean, going forward, Florida State has not been good this season. Then they play an FCS school in the Citadel. And then, South Carolina, not the best team, but not the worst either. They've shown that they could be pretty good this season. But they also can get helped out a bit this weekend because if Notre Dame beats Miami, they don't have to worry about Miami. They'll probably stay in the top 4. And then if Notre Dame loses to Miami, Clemson will probably just jump up to 3.
I think really as long as they have the College Football Playoff Committee wrapped around their finger, they're making the College Football Playoff. It's that's how I've been seeing it the past couple of years. But I think if you're Clemson, the biggest key is you've got to stay healthy, and you can't overlook Florida State, of course, without their quarterback. They're not very good. The Citadel is also not very good. In South Carolina, I think it'll be a tough game. I don't think it'll be very close. Especially the past few years as South Carolina has dipped a little bit. But they just have to stay healthy. They really struggled without Kelly Bryant when he left the game against Syracuse. Henry Renfro is that really pesky Julian Edelman or Wes Welker type player who always finds a way to be open. And Tavian Feaster is the team's second leading rusher. So certainly many players to keep an eye on for these Clemson Tigers. But if you start racking up injuries late in the season, that's kind of when it gets you. And if you're injured against a Miami team in the ACC Championship game, I think they could really make them pay.
Yeah, for me personally, not trying to show any bias here, obviously being from South Carolina, but I wouldn't be so quick to overlook that Clemson versus South Carolina game, Battle for the Palmetto State on November 25th, because the last time Clemson came to Columbia, Tigers were number 1 in the country, and South Carolina was 3-8 entering that game, and it was only 37-32, with Clemson scoring pretty late to take the lead and hold on to win. South Carolina's a much better team, obviously, now than they were then, and I think a team that not necessarily will, but certainly has the capability. We saw the fight they put up at Georgia this past weekend. That's an interesting matchup, something to keep an eye on. Maybe Clemson gets caught on look-ahead alert. I know that's hard to say in a rivalry, but Clemson being in the ACC Championship, especially if Miami is undefeated going into that game, something to keep your eye on as we continue and further on down the road.
I think it's tough for South Carolina, too, in that game because they have so many injuries that they're dealing with, especially Deebo Samuel, a couple of offensive weapons there for them. I think it's going to be tough, but I think they could make it interesting, like you said.
Yeah, Deebo Samuel obviously done for the season. Broken leg, I think, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and then running back Rico Dowell has been out with a sprained ankle for the past couple weeks, but I think Will Muschamp thinks he'll be ready, especially in time for Clemson, their last game of the regular season. Let's move on to another really interesting in-state rivalry that happened this past weekend. Number 5 Oklahoma at number 11 Oklahoma State. And if you're a fan of offense, this was a fun one to watch. The Sooners won 55-52 behind 598 passing yards from Baker Mayfield, 7 total touchdowns. Guys, with the way the people in front of him played, Baker Mayfield's got to be the Heisman frontrunner now, right?
I mean, you would think with how this past week went down, I mean, like you said, 598 yards through the air. And Saquon Barkley didn't get anything going against Michigan State. JT Barrett did not have a good game against Iowa, and Khalil Mack did not do that well against USC either. So, I mean, from the looks of it, Baker Mayfield certainly had his best game.
Khalil Mack's playing for the Raiders, but
Khalil Tate. My bad. But yeah,
yeah, got your point.
Yeah. Anyway, I think really he certainly is the Heisman frontrunner right now, and as Mitch mentioned, there were some things that played into his favor with Saquon Barkley really having 2 down weeks. 2 weeks ago at Ohio State and last week at Michigan State. JT Barrett threw 4 interceptions in the blowout loss to Iowa, and Bryce Love only had 69 yards on the ground in Stanford's loss to Washington State. So I think it helped that players in the race with Mayfield didn't play well, and that Baker Mayfield just had an incredible game. So he got a lot of help, but he helped himself out. Oklahoma having 785 total yards of offense, 600 of those coming from Baker Mayfield. That's the type of performance that vaults a player into the driver's seat of the Heisman race.
Yeah, I think moving on to another point on a larger scale for Oklahoma, I think, James, you've already kind of told us where you stand on this, but Mitch, were you surprised to see Oklahoma State 5 in the college football playoff rankings? I think, me and James, I think, would say that I thought that it was surprising that they didn't overtake Clemson for that number 4 spot.
I mean, yeah, I thought it was definitely a bit surprising. Oklahoma State, even they were ranked 11. They had lost. They already did have 1 loss, but it's never easy to go on the road in college football and get a win like that. In Oklahoma, they've beaten what was the number 2 ranked Ohio State on the road, and they went to Bedlam, beat Oklahoma State on the road, and Clemson, their best road win was against Virginia Tech, and they lost on the road to Syracuse. So I thought Clemson shouldn't be where they are. I thought Oklahoma should be there.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, if you're Oklahoma, you can't really complain all too much because obviously you'd have to think if they beat TCU this coming weekend that they will certainly leapfrog Clemson for that number 4 spot.
You would think.
Yeah, it is Clemson, as James has duly noted earlier in the show. Let's move on. A crazy upset for number 6 Ohio State, who went on the road to take on Iowa. I know that Kinnick Stadium is a tough place to play, but Iowa won 55-24. What on earth happened to the Ohio State Buckeyes, who had just an outstanding fourth quarter comeback against Penn State, and really looked like Ohio State was back in the college football playoff conversation? So much for that, I guess.
Well, you mentioned that they ran into Iowa in Kinnick Stadium as a ranked team. And the Hawkeyes are now 4-2 versus top 5 teams in non-bowl games since 2008. They could be 5-1 had they not given up a last-second touchdown to Penn State earlier this year. Biggest thing for me was the turnovers. This was not the same JT Barrett we had seen 1 week prior at home against Penn State. 4 interceptions for the Buckeyes, while Iowa did not turn the ball over once. Hawkeyes just played clean football and really controlled the pace of the game right from kickoff.
Yeah, it was just a really good defensive performance by Iowa in general. JT Barrett didn't have the best first couple games of the season. Really turned around after that Oklahoma game. Thought no one really could tell what his big game potential was. Thought he did really well against Penn State, but then lost it all at Iowa. I mean, 18 of 34 for 200 yards and 4 picks. Not that great.
Yeah, we talk about JT Barrett struggling in big games. Well, his counterpart, Iowa quarterback Nate Stanley, has been outstanding at Iowa's 2 biggest wins, obviously beating Iowa State in an overtime thriller. That's a big rivalry for Iowa every year. And then this Ohio State game, Nate Stanley's got 10 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. That accounts for a 90 QBR. He's been outstanding, and something Iowa hasn't seen at the quarterback position in a long time. He's like a sophomore, too. Akram Wadley also went over the century mark on the ground. This was just a complete performance on both sides of the ball, because if you look at the defense, JT Barrett picked off 4 times, 3 of those off Josh Jackson, who does not get enough attention. He's probably, I think he's at least a top 2 corner in the country, probably up to number 1 after the week he had. Does not get talked about all that much because, well, Iowa, I mean, not to say they're irrelevant, they're ranked, but they don't get the national attention of some bigger schools.
Yeah, you mentioned Wadley averaged 6 yards a rush. From what I saw, this was really just a great team win for Iowa. They were firing on all cylinders all day, and really just controlled. I think they controlled the pace of play. They had the play clock controlled. I don't know what the exact numbers were on that, but they really won all facets of the game from what I could see.
Yeah.
Iowa State. They had Iowa had 34 minutes of possession to Ohio State's 25.
Yeah, and I mean, when you win all facets of the game, you expect to win by 31 points. That's exactly what Iowa did. But moving on, this wasn't the only upset in the Big Ten. Number 7, Penn State went on the road, took on number 24, Michigan State. Spartans won on a game-winning field goal as time expired by a score of 27-24. But earlier on in this game, there was a 3.5-hour rain delay. Do you guys think that delay hurt Penn State in particular more so than it did Michigan State?
I mean, yeah, you could say that it hurt them. I mean, but Michigan State had to go through the same delay. Obviously, Michigan State might have a little bit of help since they're at home. But, the crowd certainly didn't affect anything because a majority of them went home. But, I mean, it's always tough when, you get hyped for an earlier game and then you have to sit down for 3.5 hours just to get back and play. It's really tough to do.
Yeah, I don't think the rain helped them by any means. I think there were other issues aside from the weather on Saturday for Penn State. Firstly, the Michigan State defense really stepped up and completely bottled up Saquon Barkley in the first half. So the Spartans run a 4-3 defense, meaning there's four defensive linemen and 3 linebackers. And when Barkley would line up in the backfield next to Trace McSorley in the shotgun, 3 of the 4 defensive linemen would shift to whatever side he was on, and that would close up most of the running lanes for Barkley. The second half was a bit different for Michigan State since they saw how McSorley was beating them with the dump-out throws to the flats, and they backed off the blitz. But the offense still could not turn it up down the stretch for Penn State. So really good adjustments by Michigan State on the defense. And Brian Lewerke, unclear on the pronunciation there, he had a really good game for Michigan State too. So even in the rain, he passed the ball for over 400 yards. So again, another great solid game by Michigan State.
I think a little earlier you were talking about Saquon Barkley, and that was something that just kind of drove me crazy when I was looking at this box score because, you think about the conditions, 3.5-hour rain delay, it was raining the whole game. He gets the ball 14 times. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I know he got bottled up early in that first half, but it wasn't like he was just being shut down. I think he had like 67 yards on those 14 carries. I mean, he was all right, and he's the best player on your team, if not one of the best players in the country. I thought he just did not get the ball enough, and Penn State got way too pass happy. But on the flip side, give some credit to Michigan State. How about this? They're in control of their own destiny in the Big Ten now, and that's a team that was 3-9 a year ago. So give a lot of credit to Pat Antonio and that Spartans group for turning it around from a rough season last year.
Yeah, I think when you were watching the game on the computer, you mentioned that Saquon Barkley is not getting nearly enough touches, and that Penn State was just throwing the ball, it seemed like nearly every play. So I don't know quite what the game plan was there. I guess they thought that they needed to pass the ball more because they knew Saquon Barkley would get the ball, but it really didn't seem like it was working for him.
Yeah, and I mean, I just don't know. I'm completely baffled by it. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But anyway, it is what it is. And obviously, from the scoreline, you could tell Penn State really paid the price for it. And finally, probably the premier matchup of the weekend for college football. Number 10, Miami welcomed number 13, Virginia Tech to town as a big-time ACC Coastal matchup. I think all three of us have criticized Miami at least a little bit throughout the course of the season. They're undefeated, but they haven't exactly played all that well, really in any game at all. But gosh, they looked really good on Saturday night against Virginia Tech.
Yeah, I thought they really, I thought they deserved some criticism going into this game, and only because they had close wins against a mediocre Georgia Tech team and Florida State, who also is not very good without DeAndre Francois. So I think they deserve some of that criticism that was headed their way. But I really thought that Virginia Tech would play better than they did. Josh Jackson struggled in the second half and couldn't really find a rhythm all night. But I mentioned last week that this Miami defense has been winning the turnover battles, and their defense has played very well this season. They forced 3 turnovers in the second half alone, and Malik Rozier was able to put the game with a 43-yard pitch and catch to tight end Christopher Herndon, who ran it in for the score. So the defense really stepped up for Miami, which gave the offense opportunities to score more towards the later part of the game.
Yeah, James, you mentioned Miami. They hadn't really had a very convincing win over the course of the season. the previous week against and at that point a winless North Carolina, who they didn't pull away until the end of the game. But coming in, you mentioned their defense did a great job. They forced 4 fumbles. They recovered 2 of them, and then also picked off Josh Jackson twice. Just a really solid defensive performance that helped Miami pull ahead in that game.
Yeah, have you seen the gold chain that Miami uses for every turnover? That kind of seems like it's the defensive symbol for every turnover they force. Whoever forced the turnover gets to wear that big gold chain with the gold U on it. Perfect for Miami. I mean, we saw that plenty on display on Saturday night.
Yeah, I think it's something a lot of teams do. Like you said, it really does fit Miami very well, and just kind of like their play style and who they are as a football team and their identity. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something a lot of teams, not just Miami, really pride themselves on, and I think it's a great idea for whoever started it. I don't know even know where it started, but I see a lot around college football nowadays, and I mean, for Miami especially, it works out really well. That defense really prides themselves on turnovers. But I want to focus a little bit more on this offense for Miami, and I think the reason why they've been so unimpressive for an undefeated team over the course of the season, because offensively they just don't really have like an identity anymore without Mark Walton, their leading rusher. He's done for the year. Travis Homer at times has played well and has big playability in him, but Malik Rozier threw 3 interceptions in this game. He wasn't great by any stretch of the imagination, still made a lot of mistakes, and I just worry that while this Miami defense is elite, you can't say the same about that Miami offense, and I just wonder if that's going to catch up to them against a team like Clemson in the ACC Championship or Notre Dame this weekend, which is a big-time game. We'll get to that a little later in the show. But we've talked about college football playoff rankings a couple times throughout the course of this segment. I'll end with this. Miami only moved up to 7 despite the win, still behind TCU at number 6. Were you guys surprised to see that?
I mean, I was a little surprised since, Miami, they are undefeated still, and they are in a good Power 5 conference. But at the same time, that was like their big marquee win. They hadn't blown anyone out all season. They didn't necessarily blow out Virginia Tech. It was their best win of the season, I would say. I mean, a little surprised not to see just because of, again, their record. But at the same time, I could see why, because of how they've played in the past.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised, only because I thought they would be ahead of TCU. Solely, I think TCU has a couple of better wins. The one loss obviously hurts them a little bit, but I think in the eyes of the committee, the wins are more important than the losses. As Mitch just said, this was really Miami's first big win, and I think if they beat Notre Dame this week, then this could be a bit of a different story as we talk 1 week from now. But I was a little bit surprised initially, but the more I think about it, the more I understand why Miami is where they are.
Yeah, something we've seen a lot, up and down the rankings from the playoff committee in these first 2 rankings is big wins really seem to outweigh bad losses. And if you've beaten good teams, even having a loss on your record doesn't do you much harm if you have big wins to even out those bad losses. We see that with Miami. We see it also with Wisconsin being further down in the rankings than some one-loss teams. But and finally, I'll end the segment as we always do with our performance of the week, and this time I'll start with James.
My performance of the week comes from the ranks of the service academies. This week, it is the quarterback for Army West Point, Ahmad Bradshaw. As we know, the service academies love to run the triple option offense, and really they have no choice due to the size of their men on the line. Bradshaw was thrust into the starting quarterback position last season, and ever since, he helped break the 14-year streak of Navy beating Army. He's been on a roll. Bradshaw rushed 23 times for 263 yards on the road against Air Force this weekend. He averaged 11.5 yards per rush as he led the Black Knights to a road win at Air Force for the first time since 2005. And for the 3rd time this season, Army has won a game without completing a pass.
And I'm going to go with Baker Mayfield, the Oklahoma quarterback, completed 24 of 36 passes for 598 yards, 5 touchdowns through the air and 1 on the ground as Oklahoma defeated their rival, Oklahoma State, on the road.
Yeah, a big beneficiary for Baker Mayfield. Sophomore wide receiver Marquise Brown, who had 9 catches for 265 yards, 2 touchdowns, could have gotten my performance of the week, but instead I'll go with USC running back Ronald Jones II. I think he's the key to their offense. They go as he goes, not as all-everything quarterback Sam Darnold goes, because Darnold's dealt with turnover issues all year long. But a large part of that's because USC's offense has become pass-heavy. For the Trojans to be successful, I think this is what's been said for USC throughout the course of the season. They need balance offensively, and it starts and ends with the guy they call Rojo. Ronald Jones had 194 yards and 3 touchdowns and just 27 carries in USC's win over number 22 Arizona. And if he keeps it up, I think this offense really starts to get going. They're getting healthier by the week, and if Ronald Jones continues to put up numbers like this, don't be surprised to see the Trojans in a New Year's Six Bowl come the end of the season. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, there's one game we haven't talked about from this past weekend. TCU welcomed the Texas Longhorns to town and took care of business to improve to 8-1 on the season. We'll recap that one right after this.
When I grow up, I want to be a new pair of blue jeans.
When I grow up, I want to be a kid's first computer.
I want to be a warm fleece on a
I
cold
want to be
day.
a football
I want to be
stadium.
a bike that races around the country.
I want to be a bench on a forest trail.
When I grow up, I don't want to be a piece of garbage. And if you recycle me, I won't be.
Give your garbage another life. Recycle. Learn how at iwanttoberecycled.org. Brought to you by Keep America Beautiful and the Ad Council.
Have you heard the buzz about West Nile virus? Protect yourself and your family from the mosquito bites that spread the virus. When you go outside, use mosquito repellent containing DEET. When possible, wear long-sleeve shirts and pants. And remove standing water around your home where mosquitoes breed. Anyone can become infected, but if you're over 50, you're at higher risk for severe disease or even death from West Nile virus. Remember, the best defense comes from things you can do yourself. Fight the bite. Tell mosquitoes to buzz off.
Welcome back to Friday Night Sports. As I said before, before the break, TCU welcomed Texas Longhorns to town, and what were they? Number 8 TCU Horned Frogs.
Yeah, number 8
welcomed Texas town, took care of business 24-7. This defense has been absolutely dominant, averaging just under 7 points per game allowed over the past 4 weeks, and sits at number 2 in the country defensive efficiency behind the one and only Alabama. From a defensive standpoint, how impressed were you with Saturday's performance?
I mean, it's like they've been pretty much all season, absolutely dominating at stopping the run game. They allowed Texas to a total of 9 rushing yards over 26 attempts. The passing game at times could struggle a little bit. Texas has some pretty tall receivers. But overall, just really solid. While they can give up some yards, they've done a great job at keeping opposing teams out of the end zone.
Yeah, it's kind of like business as usual for the TCU defense. Put a lot of pressure on Shane Buechele, especially late in the game when the Longhorns' offensive line was worn out. I was also really impressed by the Texas defense. It kept the door open for the offense to make it a game and ended up forcing 8 3-and-outs, which kept the TCU offense off the field for the most part. The only thing that worried me about TCU defense was the secondary and the corners. There were a couple of big plays. That one play was to
Colin Johnson.
Colin Johnson, thank you. I was going to say Calvin Johnson, but he's retired.
They have similarities, that's for sure.
Indeed. And that one worried me a little bit. It's just kind of throwing it up in a bit of a jump ball. But overall, I thought the defense played very well and really gave the opportunity to the offense to just go up and score.
Yeah, that's interesting, James, because, the way I saw it was, you can give a lot of credit to Colin Johnson. That's an unreal catch he makes for Texas's only touchdown. And if he doesn't make that catch, you could argue this would have been a shutout for TCU defensively. They held Texas just to 4 of 18 on third down. I thought they were outstanding, especially that front four caused havoc for Shane Buechele all night long. And just one outstanding play from a really good wide receiver away from having a shutout, which would have been TCU's 3rd of the season. I think that's more where I stand on it than calling out the corners for not being able to make a play on the ball, giving up 5 or 6 inches against Colin Johnson. So not much more you could ask.
Yeah, you did talk about that front four, though. Ben Bandigu, I think, had back-to-back sacks at one point. Jeff Boson continues to really wreak havoc. So Matt Bosen, sorry. That specifically the defense, that part of the defense really impresses me. And of course, they're the main ones stopping the run game along with Traven Howard and guys behind them. So really great defensive effort.
Yeah, I mean, the defense had 7 total sacks against Texas. Ty Summers got 1, Bandigu got 2, those 2 in a row. Bradley and Bosen, I think it's 4 games in a row with a sack for Bosen as well. So just the front 4, well, interchangeable because people are moving in and out. But the front 4 for TCU has been so dominant this season.
And flipping sides of the ball a little bit, I think we talk about it every week, but Kenny Hill was okay, especially early on. 17 points from TC's first 4 drives. A lot of it had to do with Kenny Hill's ability to move the ball, but he struggled throughout pretty much the rest of the game. What are you guys' thoughts on Hill's play this past week?
I mean, it was interesting because Kenny Hill was 18 of 26 in the game total, but he did at one point complete 12 passes in a row, which is interesting to think that for the rest of the game he was only 6 of 14. For those 12 in a row, being a really good job at just making the smart passes, getting the checkdowns and the dumps. I think the big thing though is in addition to the running game, really got to get into the passing game. Really need some more, I would say, passing touchdowns. So the other teams can't really just focus on the run.
Yeah, I really liked what I saw earlier on. I thought the offense did a really good job executing. It was a big statement for the Horned Frogs to march down the field in 9 plays and go 75 yards and score to just build some momentum and go right into this game and get an early lead. They settled for a field goal on the next drive when they surely could have gotten a touchdown, but then executed a 5-play drive in just a minute 31, just capped off with a 14-yard run by Kyle Hicks. So I think Darius Anderson got more carries on Saturday night, which I thought was encouraging. He's going to be a big factor this Saturday. Kyle Hicks couldn't quite break it open aside from his 14-yard touchdown, but I thought Kenny Hill did very well early in the game, but the offense in general was a bit stagnant until the fourth quarter. But I think that's partially due to the very good Texas defense.
Yeah, I was going to get to that. Give some credit to this Texas defense. They held Oklahoma to 29 points a couple weeks ago, and Oklahoma State to 13 in an overtime game last weekend. So we just saw those two teams play a game in the 50s. So if you're wondering how explosive those offenses can be and how well Texas did at just containing them, I think that tells you all you need to know. Going back to what you guys have kind of talked about a little bit with this offense riding Darius Anderson a little bit. Were you surprised to see that? Because for me personally, I'm not against running the ball. I think when you have a guy like Darius Anderson and he's going the way he was on Saturday night, you got to feed him the ball. But at the same time, this offense has to have some balance. And Kenny Hill's confidence was probably shot a pretty decent amount after the way he played against Iowa State 2 weeks ago. And you're trying to get him ready to compete and almost match Baker Mayfield with that offense every time they score coming up. So I was a little surprised to see Sonny Cumbie go way to get a little run heavy in a sense, and I thought maybe he just doesn't trust Kenny Hill as much. Or what did you guys think of all that?
Yeah, I agree. I think this season, we've talked about it before, we don't see a lot of big, deep throws, don't see a lot of explosive plays, and that's something that TCU fans are not used to. And I think going to the run game is fine. I don't have a real problem with it, but you've got to be able to have big plays through the air too, because at some point your run game is going to be able to be stopped. And so I'm fine with it, but I think there needs to be a little less run, a little more pass. I think Kenny Hill is fine to dump off sometimes, but at some point you're going to have to make some throws over the middle. You're going to have to go deep a couple of times, especially with a not so great Oklahoma defense coming up. You got to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I think for a majority of the season, TCU has actually been a bit more run heavy, contrary to what you see from just a typical Big 12 offense in general. But kind of some of it could go back to last season, how Kenny Hill wasn't the best passer. He's been much improved this season, still being able to manage the game pretty well. But like you mentioned, James, the run can always be stopped at some point if you especially if you stack the box enough. And we're going to start needing to see big plays from Kenny Hill and the wide receivers. Got to put a bit more trust in both Kenny Hill and the receivers. Just throw it up, hope they can catch it, I guess.
All right, well, let's move on. Obviously, all eyes for TCU this weekend move to their big matchup in Norman with number 5 Oklahoma. We'll preview that one a little later in the show, but let's segue over into baseball. I know the season is over. Congratulations to the Houston Astros, by the way. I don't think I said that last week for winning the World Series. But we have our MVP or our MLB award finalists were released earlier this week. They'll be announced sometime next week. So quick rundown of these. Start with the AL MVP finalists: Jose Altuve, Aaron Judge, Jose Ramirez. Guys, who do you think should win? Based on those numbers, I have to say it's a 2-horse race.
I mean, for me personally, I think it's you got to go Aaron Judge. Yeah, he had 60 points lower in batting average, but he had a better on-base percentage, better slugging percentage, so obviously a better OPS. Had a bunch of home runs, walked a lot. He did strike out over 200 times, but he walked an insane amount of times. Again, getting that on-base percentage so high. 114 RBIs, 128 runs scored. He was the key to that Yankees team, and so that's why I think Aaron Judge deserves it over Altuve.
As much as they say the postseason doesn't play a role in choosing who the MVP is, I think the committee will probably end up picking Altuve. I think Judge should be the MVP. Yes, he does have a lower average. However, Judge has a better OBP, as Mitch just said, in slugging. There are more numbers that play into the favor of Judge, like walks and RBI and extra base hits and things like that. But the biggest thing to remember is that the Yankees weren't even supposed to be in this position where they were this year, a game away from the World Series. They weren't supposed to peak until next year when they got all of their youth up and playing consistently. So without Judge, there's no way that the Yankees would have been where they were this season. And that's why he's the MVP, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's such an interesting conversation because, we don't really have a solid definition for what the most valuable player is. And for Aaron Judge, is probably the most valuable player to his team, but you can make an argument Jose Altuve over the course of the regular season has been much more consistent and was good enough in the postseason to keep up that consistency at a certain level, obviously leading Houston to a World Series. So I think it's an interesting argument. I agree with you, James. I think if Altuve wins, the voters obviously would show that they're factoring in postseason play, despite saying they do not. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. And it's just an interesting race because it's very close, and it's not very often we don't really know who's going to win an MVP race this late, especially with the season done. That being said, let's move on to the NL MVP finalist. Giancarlo Stanton's got to be the clear favorite. I would have to think other guys that made the finalist, Joey Votto and Paul Goldschmidt. Guys, thoughts on these?
Yeah, one away from 60 home runs. You don't hear that very often. The Marlins never really were in the postseason hunt, and in early September they got to a point where they were 5 games back of the second wildcard spot. But Stanton has been the face of the Marlins and really kind of put them into that position of possibly making a late run to the playoffs. And even before the passing of Jose Fernandez, Stanton was really the face of the Marlins. His power is unbelievable, not something we've seen before in a long, long time. I think Joey Votto and Paul Goldschmidt deserve a look, especially Votto. His on-base percentage and walks led the majors, and he ranked 3rd in OPS. Unfortunately for him and Goldschmidt, though, Stanton had an even better year.
Yeah, Giancarlo Stanton had an absolute fantastic year, 59 home runs, well over 100 RBIs. But again, I like how Joey Votto played. 320 batting average, 36 home runs, 100 RBIs. I mean, honestly, I think if Giancarlo Stanton has, 10 less home runs, you got to give it to Votto with just how well he played overall. And, Goldschmidt, I think there are two guys on the Diamondbacks who had over 100 RBIs. I mean, that team is just an offensive powerhouse. But I think you got to give it to Stanton.
Yeah, I agree with both of you guys. I don't really think there's much to be said. Give credit, obviously, to Votto and Goldschmidt, but, unfortunately for them, Giancarlo Stanton had a monster year. Let's move on to the pitching standpoint side of things. AL Cy Young finalists Corey Kluber, Luis Severino, and Chris Sale. Guys, for me, it's Corey Kluber who should win. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'm right with you there. I think it's close between him and Chris Sale. I'm excited to see Luis Severino in this race. I think it's a sign of more to come from him. As for Kluber, he sits at the top with an 18-4 record. He's got the lowest ERA of 2.25 in all of baseball. He ranks third in strikeouts and second in opponent average. And he was in even better form this year than when he won in 2014. So I think this is Kluber's to win this year.
And Kluber, coming off the DL this year, did absolutely fantastic. I don't know how many games he had where he had over 10 strikeouts. It was pretty insane. But yeah, with the way he pitched, especially coming back after that injury, he's got a 2.25 ERA, and he also has a .87 WHIP. So giving up pretty much less than one base runner pretty much per inning that he's pitched. I think he was so dominant. He really helped the Indians get to where they were.
Yeah, I don't know that this would really contribute to the conversation because obviously they don't factor in postseason play. But I mean, between the three of them, none of them were really even okay in the postseason. They all had major struggles in October. I think that's just something that's kind of interesting for guys who were so good throughout the course of the regular season. Probably the aces of their staffs, I guess you could say. Maybe Severino's not quite at an ace level yet, but I was just surprised to see all three of them really struggle, pretty poor in the postseason.
Yeah, and I think that's what Clayton Kershaw had to knock of, and that'll take us right into our NL Cy Young talk. But Clayton Kershaw struggled a little bit in the postseason, and as did Max Scherzer even a little bit. Steven Strasburg, kind of a different story, but yeah, I don't know what it is with postseason and aces, but something about the October air, and it kind of changes something.
Yeah, well, with that being said, yeah, we'll jump right in. You mentioned Kershaw. He's my pick to win it. Obviously, you said Scherzer and Strasburg. The other two guys, quick note, Max Scherzer, 268 strikeouts. That's a ridiculous number. For me, that makes him a close second. Unfortunately, Kershaw was just so good throughout the course of this season. I thought Scherzer was a little bit more up and down.
Yeah, I actually took Scherzer in this, and I did think he was a little bit up and down. He had a couple of rough starts. Kershaw definitely more consistent, but Max Scherzer said that this season, or that his next goal in winning a World Series, of course, would be to throw a 20 strikeout game, which is pretty difficult, and he'll have to wait until next season to try and reach that. But he was third in the majors in ERA, second in strikeouts, and held batters to a major league best 178 average. He also pitched 25 more innings than Strasburg and Kershaw, gave up less hits than both, and only had 11 more earned runs than Kershaw and 7 more than Strasburg. For me, this is one of the toughest awards to figure out because all three of these players are near the top in every category.
Yeah, I actually had Scherzer as well. I mean, all three of these pitchers just, especially Kershaw and Scherzer, two of the best pitchers you've seen in the last couple of years. But Scherzer, pitching more games, more innings, giving up less hits, just an insane amount of strikeouts. 268 and 200 innings. Didn't have as many wins as Kershaw, but I don't think wins always factor in to how good of a pitcher is. You also got to think of the offense. Still had a 2.5 ERA and also had a .9 WHIP. So again, averaging less than one base runner an inning. Just absolutely, both pitchers, or all three pitchers, absolutely dominant. But I think, for me personally, I think Scherzer edges out Kershaw.
And, well, we'll go from probably one of the tougher decisions for the MLB voters from the NL Cy Young to the undoubtedly the easiest vote of the year, AL Rookie of the Year, Andrew Benintendi, Aaron Judge, and Trey Mancini. Guys, we talked about Judge a little earlier. I thought Andrew Benintendi, though, had a really good year and really had Rookie of the Year type numbers. Unfortunately, Aaron Judge put up MVP type numbers.
Yeah, I think it goes without saying that Aaron Judge will be named the AL Rookie of the Year. Benintendi did have a solid rookie year, hit well against the Yankees, ironically, and had 20 home runs, so displayed his ability to hit the ball over the fence, but also had the second most walks of all AL rookies, which showed he had patience at the plate, and 20 stolen bases as well, so he's got some wheels under there. Trey Mancini flew completely under the radar because he's living in the shadows of Judge and Benintendi in that AL East. He had actually the most hits of all AL rookies and was tied for third most home runs with 24, and he was second in average right behind Gurriel of Houston. So Really, just a great year from Aaron Judge and a breakout year. Unfortunately for Benintendi and Mancini, he was just so much better than those two.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great year from all three of those guys. But Aaron Judge being in the MVP race, just having the year that he did, it's no question that he should get AL Rookie of the Year.
And we'll move over to the NL Rookie of the Year. I would have to think this was also a pretty easy decision. Josh Bell, Cody Bellinger, and Paul DeJong, your finalists. Cody Bellinger, 39 home runs in just 132 games. He had an outstanding year. Really almost came out of nowhere for the Los Angeles Dodgers, filling them all the way to a World Series appearance. He's got to be the clear favorite, right, guys?
Yeah, I agree. I think the obvious choice here is Cody Bellinger, and I think he deserves it, and he's going to win. But I think Paul DeJong deserves some credit as well. Filled in for Aledmus Diaz after he got sent down to AAA, and off in his first at bat, actually homered off All-Star closer Greg Holland. So I think there's more to come for the Cardinals there. But Bellinger second in slugging and stolen bases, led rookies in strikeouts, however, so a little swing happy. But he also led rookies in the home runs in the National League. But Josh Bell and Paul DeJong were fourth and fifth with 26 and 25 respectively. But for Bellinger, it just seemed like night after night it was another home run for Bellinger. I think he's hands down the NL Rookie of the Year.
I mean, Bellinger, he was that guy. He would put on a show, when you'd go see him play. A lot of talks early on when he came up, him and Aaron Judge were at one point pretty much neck and neck with home runs. I mean, Bellinger was, a couple weeks behind, but both guys just absolute sluggers. And, again, while Josh Bell and Paul DeJong had great seasons, Paul DeJong making the most of his opportunity when he got his start. But, no question as well for the National League, got to go Bellinger.
And we'll move from some player awards to the manager awards. Your AL Manager of the Year finalists, Terry Francona, A.J. Hinch, Paul Molitor. Guys, what are your thoughts on the finalists? Who do you think should win?
I think Francona and Hinch, very good managers. They had some help with the front office, made some good decisions. But I think Paul Molitor and I think he should win the AL Manager of the Year. To be quite honest with you, him and the Twins were the first team to go from losing 100 games to making the postseason the next year. The Twins were also highly criticized for being sellers at the trade deadline, most notably sending closer Brandon Kinsler to Washington, Jaime Garcia to New York. But then the Twins responded by ripping off 20 wins in August. I think Francona and Hinch deserve a lot of credit for their success, but Molitor did something that's never been done before.
James, you and I think, are on the same page for everything right now. I think Paul Molitor should get it. I mean, again, the Twins were garbage last year, and, like the Yankees, people didn't think that they would be in a good spot this year. Obviously, people probably thought the Yankees would be better than the Twins. But the Twins, they made a really good second half run, making the wild card spot. They lost, but still making the playoffs after a 100-loss season, like you mentioned, James, never been done before. Just a great way of managing what he had and making a great team out of the Twins.
And funny enough, moving on to the NL Manager of the Year, all of them were from the NL West. Bud Black, Torey Lovullo, and Dave Roberts. Guys, who's your pick to win the NL Manager of the Year?
I think Dave Roberts is going to end up winning the award, but for me, it's close between Bud Black and Torey Lovullo. Both teams were well below 500 last season, but came out really hot this season. I doubted if the Rockies would be able to keep their level of play going for the entire season, but they proved me wrong and ended up making that wild card game against their NL West opponent, Diamondbacks. But the Diamondbacks had a lot of pieces that could make them contenders in the postseason, that being Zach Greinke, Paul Goldschmidt, Jake Lamb, and the late season addition of J.D. Martinez. The biggest thing for me here was this was Torey Lovullo's first season as a full-time manager, so I was really impressed with Lovullo. I think there's a lot of good things happening in Arizona, and they're going to be there to contend for a few years to come.
Yeah, all three teams in the NL West did a really good job. All three made the playoffs. For me, I think Dave Roberts will get it. 104 wins. Yes, they had a early September, you could say, collapse. I guess struggles is a better word. Could have possibly been on pace to break the record for most wins in a season. this saying ain't mean a thing without the ring. But I think the way the Dodgers played and the way Roberts managed his team, at least through the regular season, I think he'll get it.
And we finally have all three being picked to win. I think that makes for an exciting race because I'll go with Bud Black. I was just so surprised by the way that Colorado was able to keep up their hot start, and just guys that really hadn't played all that well throughout the course of their career really stepping up. I think of like DJ LeMahieu, and then who was that starter? Was it Kyle Freeland? That was so good for them atop the rotation.
I think he was one of them.
Yeah, and I mean Greg Holland at the back end, and just up and down throughout this roster. Colorado just had so many, bright spots. Charlie Blackmon, who was really good a year ago, but was outstanding this past season. He just continues to get better. Obviously, you think Nolan Arenado in the middle of that lineup, but for me, I'll go with Bud Black. It was just very impressive. I was surprised to see Colorado play as well as they did.
And great pitching considering it's Colorado. One guy you didn't mention, John Gray. He was 10-4. Did have a 3.67 ERA, but
it's not bad in Colorado.
Not bad in Colorado.
All right, well, let's segue back into college football, get you all set for the opening weekend. Let's segue back into college football, get you all set for another exciting weekend in college football. TCU goes on the road to Norman to take on the 5th-ranked Oklahoma Sooners. Quarterback Baker Mayfield is 2-0 in his college career against TCU, playing arguably his best football of his career heading into their third and final matchup. What are you guys looking forward to this top 10 matchup with Big 12 championship implications on the line?
Well, each of the last 5 meetings between the two have been decided by 7 points or less. Oklahoma's averaging 608 yards a game, so obviously a big task coming up for the TCU defense. Nico Small said that Coach Patterson told the defense that they've played a lot of smart games, but not a lot of good games. And I think for TCU's offense to have a chance, the defense has to play both a good game and a smart game.
Yeah, it's a matchup this week of an outstanding offense versus an outstanding defense. Oklahoma coming off of a 56 points against 55 points against Oklahoma, or 62 points against Oklahoma State. They haven't. Their lowest point total was against Texas, and we know Texas has had a good defense. And it's going to be how well can TCU hold Baker Mayfield back. And when he does score, how can the offense respond to that?
Yeah, I think it definitely makes for such an exciting matchup, especially when Oklahoma has the ball, because of how well Baker Mayfield and that offense has played over the course of the season, and how good TCU has looked on defense over the past couple of weeks, and even over the course of the season. You could argue, for me, one of the most important things is TCU's got to run the ball effectively, and you got to do it often. Take some pressure off Kenny Hill by doing that. But more importantly, that's the only way I think you can contain the Sooners offense. You keep the ball, you run clock, you give your defense a good rest between possessions, and most importantly, you keep Baker Mayfield off the field. You have to run the ball effectively and often to do that. And we saw Oklahoma State running back Justice Hill had over 200 yards last week against Oklahoma. You can run the ball on the Sooners defense. I think Sonny Cumbie's got to stick to that and really get Darius Anderson, Kyle Hicks, Sewell Onalua, all three of them going for TCU to be successful in this game.
Yeah, I totally agree. The biggest key for TCU is containing Baker Mayfield. He's got no problem making plays outside the pocket, but the corners need to stay true to who they're covering. We saw that they would come in when Baker Mayfield would break the pocket and look like he's going to throw, and then he would throw it deep to Mark Andrews or Marquise Brown. And as for Oklahoma, they've got to get to Kenny Hill, put a lot of pressure on him. This is a big game for him. They've got to make him throw the ball. TCU's been very conservative in the play calling on offense, and I don't think there's a lot of trust to see Kenny Hill throw it deep. But Darius Anderson and Kyle Hicks are going to play a big part in the run game. If they're bottled up, which I find a little bit hard to believe that they will be, Kenny Hill's going to have to be a little bit more creative in moving the ball.
And one thing for the TCU offense that they're really going to have to focus on is third downs. So far they are sixth in the nation. They've hit almost just about half of their third down conversions. But the last 2 weeks have not been good against Texas. They converted 5 of 17. It's tough to score when you're not consistently getting those first downs. You need to be able to sustain drives. TCU was able to do that really well early on in the season. They've struggled the past couple weeks, and but that's going to be one key thing that they really need to focus on offense.
Yeah, it certainly makes for an exciting matchup. Just a bunch of little things and nuances that are so intriguing in this game, and I guess we'll find out how it all pans out tomorrow evening. Let's move on to our final segment of the show. As per usual, college football pick'em. We're on to week 11. Quick rundown of the standings. Mitch is still in first with a record of 34-16. James is in second with a record of 32-17, and I'm holding down the fort in last with a record of 31-19. I'll start with a Big 12 top 25 matchup. It's a pretty intriguing one. A couple teams coming off close losses. Number 15 Oklahoma State goes on the road to take on number 21 Iowa State. Cyclones, have been so good at home over the course of this season, but Oklahoma State's offense looked really good a week ago against Oklahoma. Guys, who wins?
Iowa State's offense has only put up 30 points in their last 2 games, albeit against a couple of great defenses in TCU and West Virginia, but that still worries me. Last week it was a shootout in Stillwater, and if the Cowboys still bring that same up-tempo game, I think Oklahoma State has the capability to blow this game wide open. Iowa State's not going to fear the Cowboys, and as we've seen, Ames is not an easy place to play. However, I think there will be too much offense for the Cyclones to handle. I like the Cowboys on the road.
And Oklahoma State, they have a very explosive offense. They average over 570 yards a game on offense. They average over 45 points a game. And I just think it'll be too much for Iowa State and their defense. So I've got the Cowboys.
Yeah, well, I'll take Oklahoma State as well, and for reasons exactly the same as James. Funnily enough, I thought you pretty much broke it down exactly how I was planning on breaking it down. So yeah, I'll stick with you guys and take Oklahoma State. Let's move on to an SEC matchup. Top-ranked Georgia goes on the road, big-time test against number 10 Auburn Tigers. Can the Tigers knock off top-ranked Georgia and their SEC record 121st meeting?
I've rolled with the Dogs in every game we've picked with them this season, so I'm tempted to do the same thing. I think this will be Georgia's biggest test so far this season. Auburn is better than many expected, and they've had to figure out a way to deal with big injuries. The run game is going to fall on the shoulders of Kerryon Johnson, as Cameron Petway will miss his second straight matchup against UGA. Georgia has to be careful with the passing game, too. Wide receiver Ryan Davis is targeted on more than 25% of all pass plays for the Tigers. I think the Georgia defense is going to hold Kerryon Johnson down, and the Auburn offense really revolves around the run game. So without Johnson really breaking through, I think Jared Stidham's going to have a lot of trouble. I'll take Georgia on the road.
Both of these teams, they're really similar. They've got really solid offenses, especially on the ground. Georgia's got Sonny Michel and Nick Chubb. Auburn with Petway and Kerryon Johnson. But it's going to come down, I think, to defense, and I think Georgia has shown that they've been the better team so far this season defensively. It's going to be a close one, but I've got the Bulldogs as well.
Yeah, I think Georgia's going to have to throw the ball effectively to win the game, and I think Kirby Smart knows that. And I think with that being said, he gives freshman quarterback Jake Fromm a little bit more freedom and a little bit and a lot more pass attempts and pass calls as the game continues, especially in the second half. I think Fromm's up for the task, and Georgia stays unbeaten and more than likely atop the rankings in the college football playoff rankings. Another intriguing SEC matchup, this one between number 2 Alabama, who will go on the road to take on number 16 Mississippi State. This is Bama's second straight top 25 matchup. This time it's on the road. Will the Tide stay unbeaten?
Well, Dayton Mullen has never beaten Alabama in his 8 years in Starkville, and I don't see that happening this weekend. I think it'll be a close game, don't get me wrong. Alabama's injuries are starting to catch up with them. They lost Sean Deion Hamilton and Mac Wilson in the win over LSU. Hamilton is the big loss because he relayed the play calls and was primarily responsible for making pre-snap adjustments. I think for that reason, Mississippi State's going to keep it close, but not close enough. Alabama gets the tough road win in Starkville.
Alabama, their defense is so good. And their offense, while not necessarily explosive in the passing game, they're really good on the ground, and Jalen Hurts doesn't turn the ball over. Alabama, they're going to keep the ball. And I think they're going to beat Mississippi State.
Yeah, you mentioned injuries to Alabama's defense. Don't forget about Minkah Fitzpatrick, their All-American corner, who won't play in this game either. I think Nick Fitzgerald in this Mississippi State offense has the potential to cause troubles for Alabama's defense. The problem is in these past few weeks, Mississippi State's has just been one-dimensional offensively. They can't throw the ball at all. That being said, I think Alabama prepares well and executes their game plan well and Tide roll. And let's move on to the big matchup here in Fort Worth. Well, I guess it's in Norman, but still a big matchup between number 5 Oklahoma, who welcomes number 6 TCU to town. This is arguably a Big 12 championship playing game, so who wins?
Well, the good thing for TCU this weekend is that the Oklahoma defense is just atrocious. They are the definition of a Big 12 defense. They're ranked 87th nationally in total defense, 88th in defensive yards per play, and 75th in scoring defense. And the college football playoff recognizes that. And if nothing changes for the defense, they could find themselves out of the top 4 because of that bad defense. I'm worried that Baker Mayfield is going to make a good number of large plays and that the TCU offense isn't going to be able to keep up. Unfortunately, I like the Sooners at home.
It's again, like I mentioned when we were previewing it, it's going to be it's a matchup of a great defense versus a great offense. But I think with how Oklahoma has struggled defensively, especially they showed a lot of holes in their defense last week. I think Kenny Hill will gain a bit more confidence, be able to make a bit more plays. The ground game is going to be really good for TCU as well. I've got TCU with the upset in a tight one.
Yeah, for me, I'm with James. I just think Baker Mayfield's playing such great football right now. I think, I just don't know that there's a way you can contain. And this TCU defense has been outstanding, but at a certain point, great offense beats great defense, and Baker Mayfield has the potential to do that. I think this becomes a high-scoring game, which is not what TCU wants, and I just don't know how Kenny Hill is able to keep up with it. I'll take the Sooners as well, but as I said last week, though, I hope I'm wrong again. And finally, College Game Day will go to Coral Gables tomorrow. Number 3 Notre Dame comes to town to take on the 7th-ranked Miami Hurricanes. It's a rival of a big-time rivalry in the 1980s, the Catholics versus the Convicts, as it was called then. It's a couple of college football powerhouses historically that meet again, and both are really good again this season. Who wins, guys?
I think it really helps Miami that they're at home this weekend. Miami will have another big task in containing the quarterback like last week against Virginia Tech. Brandon Wimbush and the Fighting Irish are very content with running the ball down the throats of their opponents. And I think Miami is going to be very aggressive in trying to stop the run and dare Notre Dame to throw the ball downfield. Wimbush is only completing 51% of his passes, and Notre Dame's defense gave up 587 yards last week against Wake Forest. A good chunk of those coming later in the game, but after their performance against Virginia Tech, my opinion on Miami has changed. I think Malik Rozier needs to be careful of the turnovers. His 3 interceptions are not looking good on his stats. I think Miami will make it 2 for 2 on Saturday night matchups and will find themselves in the top 5 next week.
It's tough because Notre Dame, they haven't really had a big road challenge, and this is it for them. They've got everything to lose pretty much in this against Miami. But I think, like you mentioned, Miami is going to they're going to force Brandon Wimbush to make throws. While he hasn't been the best, I think Brandon Wimbush is going to have a good game, and I've got the Fighting Irish.
Yeah, it's really a toss-up for me personally. I think the difference is Josh Adams cleared concussion protocol for Notre Dame, their star running back. He didn't even have a concussion, so that's a huge plus for Notre Dame. I think he and Wimbush so dynamic on the ground, and Wimbush really proved something to me last week. It was his ability to beat you through the air against Wake Forest. I know Miami poses a completely different threat, but we hadn't seen that from Wimbush hardly at all this year. I think it's a Notre Dame team coming in with a lot of confidence. I still worry about Miami offensively. I think Notre Dame's the more complete team, and with that being said, they go into Coral Gables and get a big time road win and pretty much secure themselves as a college football playoff into a college football playoff spot as when the season is finally done. Well, that's going to do it for us here on Friday Night Sports. If you missed anything from tonight's show, you can catch a replay of it on our Facebook page, Friday Night Sports, or on Twitter at Friday Night Sports. That's FRINIGHTSPORTS. Be sure to tune back into KTCU in an hour to catch TCU basketball's season opener against UL Monroe as the reigning NIT champions return to action. But for now, until next week, for James Flowers and Mitchell Lefebvre, I'm Ben Otten. Y'all have a great weekend.